These 12 years solution to the energy crisis. Not the crisis of today, but the bigger, more permanent crisis of a world completely drained of oil. Their crisis. And science may have an answer for them. By the time they become the peak consumers of the 21st century, scientists hope that some now embryonic experiments will have grown up too, into a new technology to power their world. At Horizon's invitation, Professor David Rose explains how the fuel of the future will work.
There's water, energy of nuclear fusion, the kind of power we hope that if we're successful will give energy for you when you're grown up. And there's as much power in this beaker of water as there is in about 15 gallons of gasoline. Look over there. Aha, well, there you are. You know, there's some irony about that explosion because in these days of the energy shortage, we didn't want to waste that much gasoline, so that explosion was mostly acetone. Up to now, we've been able to release the energy in that water in an uncontrolled way. And that was the H-bomb, which works on very different principles, and that isn't what we want at all. What we want to do is to release the energy bit by bit in a controlled way so that you can use it for energy for all mankind.
For the last 25 years, fusion scientists have been knitting wire and metal into bewildering and costly hardware, like this advanced British machine at Culham in Berkshire, here powering up for a series of tests. The physicists are not trying to generate any power here. That's still a long way off. But it's experiments like this that build up knowledge of how fusion could work. Here, they're about to discharge a very high voltage through a donut-shaped ring of gas in a few millionths of a second.
30 kilovolts. The bank is
For that split second, they'll challenge the most formidable laws of nature.
firing. 3, 2, 1.
It's my belief that fusion power has the potential of being the ultimate energy source for the world, ultimate in terms of what we know today.
It seems to me that fusion power is likely to become a reality in the next century. The speed with which we progress in that direction turns on how badly the nation needs fusion, how much it's prepared to invest in it for that reason, and it turns also on the technical progress that we make.
Charging.
Machines like this have been fired millions of times in the quest for knowledge. Knowledge that will eventually incorporate all this technology in a power-producing plant.
25 kV. 30 kV. We're about to fire. Records ready.
Records ready.
Firing. 3, 2, 1.
Over 2,000 scientists work on fusion in 50 laboratories worldwide. So far, their efforts have cost $1 billion and a quarter of a century.
The program has progressed slowly, in my opinion, because the problem is so very, very difficult. It's probably one of the most difficult scientific problems that man has ever undertaken.
Of course, you all know nuclear energy has been with us for a long time, but that's of a different kind. That's nuclear fission energy, as in a fission reactor. And the first one of those was in 1942 at the University of Chicago. And now, 30 years later, fission reactors come into use, and one sees them getting built. Nuclear fusion has been around for a long time, too. There's the sun. The sun works on fusion power, and it's held together by gravity. But we on Earth want little tiny reactions, and gravity won't help at all, so we have to think of different principles, different ways of doing the job. Any questions?
Fusion is the driving force of the universe. In every star, as in our own sun, there's a constant process of fusing the lighter atoms together, giving off tremendous power as matter becomes energy. It's a process unknown on Earth, yet the raw materials are here for the taking. The light element, deuterium, a form of hydrogen, is plentiful in the sea, and it's a perfect fusion fuel. But first it must be transformed into a state of matter that's rare on Earth. Matter on Earth has three familiar states. First, solid, like this ice block below zero. At higher temperature, solid becomes liquid. The molecules are freer and move faster. Hotter still, the liquid evaporates and ends up as a gas. Molecules shake apart into atoms. At even higher temperatures, the atoms themselves will have their electrons stripped off, leaving the hot nuclei free, the fourth state of matter. This luminous soup of nuclei is a plasma, the stuff of stars. And now, if deuterium meets its heavier relation tritium, there's nothing in theory to stop them fusing.
Now, we're going to play a little game, and when it's all over, you might think we've invented a new Morris dance, but there's more to it than that. What we're going to do is play a game of nuclear fusion, and you children are going to play the essential roles of being the nuclei. Now, nuclei are made up out of protons and neutrons, and here is a proton, and that's a red balloon, you see? And neutrons are white balloons. And what we're going to have is all the girls be deuterium atoms. Now, here is a deuterium atom, as you see, with one red proton and one white neutron. Deborah, you hold these, and you're a deuterium atom. Now, similarly, here we have a tritium atom, and it consists of one proton and two neutrons. And all the boys are going to be tritium atoms. Adrian, you hold this one. Now, you're a tritium atom, and you yourself represent the binding energy of the nucleus. Now, Deborah and Adrian, you two nuclei, now for the rules of the game.
Deuterium, one proton and one neutron. The child represents the binding energy that holds them together. Its heavier relation, tritium, one proton and two neutrons, and again the binding energy that holds them together. Let fusion commence. The protons and neutrons come together, and there is now some binding energy left over. This is liberated, and a spare neutron flies off, leaving helium, two protons and two neutrons. That's fusion. Deuterium plus tritium equals energy. And the fusion energy of the world's deuterium resources, used as heat to drive turbines, could power the world for 1,000,000 years.
Clearly, there must be some problems, otherwise controlled fusion would have been solved long ago. One big difficulty is that the nuclei repel each other electrically, so getting them close together so that they can fuse is a real problem. Now, we can introduce that idea with a new rule.
The new rule is that the children find each other absolutely repulsive. Nuclei are positively charged and are as hard to bring together as like magnetic poles, so they will always tend to deflect. To meet and achieve fusion, they must run head-on towards each other, faster and faster and faster.
In scientific terms, in real fusion, faster means hotter. And here we mean very hot indeed. The sun, which achieves controlled fusion, runs comfortably at a temperature of about 20 million degrees. On Earth, we want a much smaller reactor and must pay for the smaller size with even higher temperature. And so we look for a temperature between 200 and 1,000 million degrees.
Plasma is too hot to handle, but it can be pushed around by magnets. This is a low-temperature plasma, but at 1,000 million degrees it would vaporize anything. So the search for something to contain this devastatingly hot stuff has concentrated on devising a suitable magnetic bottle. A single electromagnet surrounding the plasma tube pinches the plasma inwards, so it's kept away from the walls. The next step is to put a second coil on the tube and hope to trap the plasma between them. and it works crudely. Effectively, the coils build a cage of magnetic fields around the plasma. The cage works because of the electric charge on each nucleus in it. The theory of magnetic confinement says that charged particles can only spiral along field lines. They don't cross them. That's fine as long as they don't collide. But after a collision, the two nuclei veer off in random directions, and so line by line, the plasma spreads outwards. And the particles find it even easier to escape at the ends, unless the cage is tightened. In practice, this means increasing the field strength to the point where it becomes the so-called magnetic mirror, one of the earliest practical confinement systems. As the particles spiral towards the densest part of the pinch, their spirals tighten on themselves so much that they're reflected back into the system. Hence the name magnetic mirror. Unfortunately, nuclei spiral at no fixed angle, and those with shallower orbits always wriggle out of the ends. Eventually, the whole plasma makes its getaway. It was the apparent impossibility of ever achieving the perfectly plasma-tight bottle that first attracted pioneers of fusion research like Peter Toneman, then working at the Clarendon Laboratory in Oxford.
I think what interested me at that time, and this was going back to the 1940s, was the question of what was I going to do with a scientific life. And it seemed to me the best way of making sure it was interesting was to choose a problem for solution which was unlikely to be solved in my own lifetime, but would keep me very busy trying to solve it for a very long time.
Toneman's brainwave was to bend the tube into a donut. The plasma swallows its tail, and there are no embarrassing ends. With magnetic coils wound evenly around the torus, the field lines keep the plasma away from the sides, as before. A later concept was to make a current flow round the plasma. The beauty of this idea is that it generates in turn a second field which encircles the plasma, turning the cage into a net. Very clever, but there was still a lot to be learnt about plasma. The fusion story was only just beginning.
Now we're going to see a cartoon film because nuclear fusion, in its early days especially, had a certain number of comic aspects. So here we go.
The comedy started when the politicians began to study fusion too. 1951, and the big three line up. There's military interest in the States. Russia has a purely scientific program, but Britain is still a favorite. There are outsiders too, and some so far outside as to be almost invisible at this stage. For the scientists, the prize is clear. Free energy for the first to finish. But the politicians hold the purse strings. So when the flag goes down, nobody seems to be ready. Or almost nobody. Then sensation. It's Argentina out in front. March 1951. And physicist Ronald Richter says he's done it. The first fusion reactor is working on a South American island. The race is over already. Not everyone's convinced by the news.
I think it produced a good deal of laughter. As far as I'm aware, this was the first time that anybody had publicly claimed that they were working in this field.
But not for long. Alas, poor Richter, no reactor. The Argentinian entry is withdrawn. But the big three are off. Triggered by the hoax, fusion research starts in earnest. But not all governments can afford it. Fusion had seemed a far-off goal before the story, but now it captured the imagination of scientists like American researcher Dick Post.
Yes, I think that it's certainly not true that everyone was started in fusion research by the Richter story, but it certainly stimulated me to be aware of it, that is, aware of fusion, where I hadn't been before.
But by 1952, the world was all too aware of fusion. Uncontrolled fusion. Peaceful fusion research was classified along with weapons work. The link was too close for comfort. The clampdown extended even to the most primitive fusion efforts. Professor Michael Pence was then working at Imperial College, London.
Well, I guess that was just about where I moved out of that particular field of work. It was being said at that time, you know, with prospects of hydrogen bombs, thermonuclear reaction suddenly became a sort of naughty word, a dirty word, a dangerous word, and you couldn't possibly have people doing experiments in basements in places like Imperial College. In university laboratories, they said, who knows, a Russian might come in, and there's nobody to stop him. And as a matter of fact, we were working in no less than the former basement lavatory on a grant from the Ministry of Supply, which couldn't, I can't remember the exact figure, but it couldn't have been much more than about £10,000 or maybe 20,000 or something like that. We were going to build a controlled fusion reactor right there in the former Gent Slough.
They never did, but the British were certainly building something hush-hush at Harwell. And what were the Russians up to all this time? Ironically, it was they who broke the 5-year silence. April 1956. The Cold War goes through one of its periodic relaxations as the Russian leaders Bulganin and Khrushchev tour Britain. Their itinerary includes a visit to some selected parts of the top-secret nuclear center at Harwell. Also in the Russian party is leading nuclear physicist, academician Ivor Kurchatov, father of Soviet fusion. Kurchatov politely asks if Harwell's fusion men would be at all interested in hearing about the highly secret Russian work in this area. The British are stunned, but yes, interested. And Kurchatov returns to lecture a packed house on Soviet results. It is clear they're not far behind. Fortunately, he doesn't embarrass his host by asking about their research work. His sense of timing is perfect, although he doesn't know it. Just a few yards away, behind closed doors, Harwell is busy assembling its own fusion secret, a version of Peter Toneman's first torus, but now scaled up into a monster donut, 3 feet across. Although the scientists want to show it to the Russians, they're prevented by a top-level security agreement with America. The situation is patently absurd. Harwell Chief Sir John Cockcroft flies to the States to confer. But the Americans are not yet ready to agree. Not until 2 years later do the wraps come off. By this time, both countries have something worth revealing, and published jointly in Nature. The British paper, in a cautious but significant phrase, describes results not inconsistent with the fusion process. When pressed for a quote by newsmen, Cockcroft goes so far as to say they are 90% certain they've got fusion.
This is Movie Tone. Jeffrey Sumner reporting. Zero Energy Thermonuclear Assembly, or ZETA, is used by British scientists.
ZETA hit every front page. Once again, it seemed as though the race was all over, bar the shouting. Who could resist a British triumph? Certainly not the press. They prophesied the millennium by 1978. In reaction to past secrecy, governments encouraged the ballyhoo. Places like Aldermaston and Los Alamos needed a new image, and a Western achievement was doubly welcome in the era of Sputniks. What had ZETA achieved? The essential and amazing fact was that Zeta's hot plasma had given off neutrons. If light atoms really had fused together, that's exactly what would be expected. But the Zeta team knew they couldn't be sure the neutrons were genuine. It was this doubt that they failed to communicate to the press. But some fusion experts were more sanguine.
I think we were pleased that something would work as well as it apparently did, but a little puzzled and a little incredulous as to the neutrons particularly. I think the neutrons were the main issue. Many of us would have believed, I think, an improved confinement time and an improved temperature to a certain extent from a large size, but there is a strong emotional content to the research, and I can't blame anyone for getting excited about an apparently very exciting result.
But that same issue of nature made it plain that the British had no monopoly on optimism. The American paper described results obtained at Los Alamos with a similar but smaller device, advisedly called the Perhapsatron. Its designer, James Tuck, chose the name after a colleague had called his 11-inch Taurus the Impossibilitron. Perhapsatron plasmas also gave off neutrons and presented the same dilemma. Were they from fusion? Perhaps. Perhaps not. In Britain, at any rate, the suspense didn't last long. When more sophisticated ways of measuring the plasma temperature had been devised 2 months later, the question of Zeta's neutrons was finally answered. The neutrons came from a side effect. There was no fusion. Today, what remains of Zeta lies together with other redundant plant, gathering dust in a corner. It advanced the state of the art a very long way, but in the public's mind, Zeta was a £1 million gamble that failed to pay off.
Well, it was only hailed as a triumph for a very short time, and then it was hailed, as you know, as a flop. I think the press had expected instant power. I don't think it had been sufficiently explained, possibly, that this was an experimental device, and it was not intended that it made electrical power.
None of the observations that we made on it or that we reported in 1958 were wrong, or would I wish to withdraw at this stage.
The trouble was the public had not read the cautious statement in Nature, only the headlines that followed.
We worked on the machine for a further 10 years after that time and obtained some extremely interesting and important results which suggested that the system could still be the basis of a future reactor.
The last vestiges of fusion secrecy were swept away later that year as the fusion powers met to display their models and put their cards on the table at Geneva. Zeta had clearly impressed the Russians. They'd brought along their own copy, called Alpha. But the revelation that stole the show was to be seen over in the American pavilion. They'd been quietly working away since 1951 on a brand new concept, here unveiled for the first time, the Stellarator. It came in a variety of shapes, but twisted or not, it was basically a torus. The novel feature was the complexity of the windings used to trap the plasma. All the participants in the great reactor race turned up, some minor ones, and even some who'd been disqualified. But for the major powers, it was a chance to exchange results. How hot were their plasmas? How long did they last? How were they confined? David Rose saw it as a turning point.
The conference was a great success, and Zeta played a substantial role in it. The problem of fusion was seen much more clearly than before. The problem of providing enough density of nuclei, confining them for a long enough time, and for a high enough temperature to be effective. Thinking back about the children's game, the situation in 1958 was almost as if there were too few children in the playground, going too slowly and for too short a time.
The depressing truth about plasma is that you've got to get 3 very difficult things right all at once for fusion to happen. First, the time. You must keep it in one place for long enough. About a second. Next, density. If there are too few particles, they can't meet. Finally, temperature. The plasma must be hot. Then the nuclei will fuse. Think of it as a graph. First, catch your plasma. The temperature scale must go up until your plasma reaches 100 million degrees. Now you must compress it along the density scale until you get 100 million nuclei per cubic centimeter. Then you've got fusion, if you can hold it all together for a second. Zeta's bid to stake a claim in the fusion flash had only got it here on the graph. Temperature too low, density too low, time too short. Worse still, the torus design had a flaw which was easier to understand than control. It was a question of the stability of the ring of plasma. If a kink developed for any reason, the encircling magnetic field was distorted too. The lines bunched up under the kink more than they did above it, and this imbalance resulted in a force that drove the plasma outwards towards the walls. These actual high-speed photographs of a plasma going out of control show the magnitude of the problem that in one form or another was to bedevil fusion researchers throughout the next decade.
The program started out very optimistically to go relative fusion reactors. They ran smack dab up against this problem of plasma physics, which required a turnaround effectively to develop that basic knowledge. There were years and years back in the 50s and the 60s when more money would not have bought anything more in the way of time or knowledge.
There was certainly money around. The Princeton complex had been completed in 1959 at a cost of $35 million, but the lack of progress was depressing. Over on the west coast, the mirror systems at Livermore were faring no better. And in Europe, the French stepped up their fusion investment and found out for themselves how difficult the problems were. But the British experience typifies the ups and downs of the 60s. Commissioned on the crest of the Zeta wave, a brand new fusion laboratory was opened at Cullum, a few miles from Harwell, in 1964. Only 2 years later, it started a 5-year rundown. It was told to halve its effort on fusion. 60 top scientists left. Part of Britain's fusion strategy had been clear. A successor to Zeta, known as ICE. It was to be very big indeed. But financial reality soon forced Britain to abandon not only ICE itself, but that whole line of research that had started with Zeta. Over in the States, another once promising line of research was about to reach a dead end. The C Stellarator, the pride of Princeton, ran into a new kind of plasma leakage, unexpected and disastrous. The results were worse than Zeta's, even further from the fusion zone. The plasma just wouldn't stay put for long enough. Nothing seemed to get results. Plasmas seemed to wriggle out of every magnetic cage. Researchers realized they were out of their depth. They had to understand plasmas, even if it meant inventing a whole new branch of physics.
What kept these collections of able people together under such difficulties, working on such almost seemingly impossible problems? I see several reasons. One was the sheer excitation of exploring a brand new field where everything you touched had never been touched before. Others were more mystical. One was a feeling of dedication amongst many of the workers, almost as if searching for the Holy Grail, but this time for that quintessence of materials by which they could unlock the secret of eternal energy for mankind. Another motivation was that many felt that nuclear energy had been used for ignoble ends, and here was a chance for mankind to recoup.
But the outlook for fusion was grim. Governments demanded results, but few could produce them. As the flow of ideas dried up, it was inevitable that the money would too. The race was at a standstill. It was fusion's darkest hour. Budgets either stood still or were cut back drastically.
Yes, I think we had a particularly difficult time here with the instruction for us to reduce the allocation of resources to this area. Other countries, of course, did not, I think, suffer in quite the same way as we did.
Without much apparent interest from the Western powers, the Russians had kept at it through the 60s. They'd encountered the same problems, but sheer persistence was starting to pay off. The new leader of Soviet fusion, academician Lev Artsimovich, took a philosophical line. Mother Nature, he said, has only a limited number of obstacles to put in our path. When all have been removed, mankind will be master of limitless energy. Thanks largely to his single-minded efforts, the Soviet fusion program got high priority. Refueled with ever-increasing sums of money, the Russians raced ahead. By any standards, they had a good idea. Through the dynamism of Artsimovich, it became a revolution. The Russians had gone back to Tauruses, unfashionable elsewhere, and taken the concept a stage further than Zeta. In fusion circles, the name tokamak was to become a household word. To, from the Russian word for toroid, mak for magnetic, and cam for chamber. Tokamak, toroidal magnetic chamber. The Russians had concentrated on generating very large and expensive magnetic fields. As in other toroids, there are two fields. One goes round the plasma, the other encircles it. But the bigger Russian fields enable them to attack the kink in a way the British couldn't afford in Zeta. This was the field they strengthened. The Russians had made no secret of their theories since 1965, but the revolution dates from 1969, when a British team actually tested their claims in Moscow and brought back the good news.
As it turned out, of course, their results were very good. And the tokamak idea is the best one that we have at the moment. The U.S. revolution took place in the spring of 1969, when academician Artsimovich came to the United States to MIT and delivered several lectures on their results and precipitated a discussion that ended up by changing the U.S. program.
And the Russians were making the running. Suddenly everyone wanted a tokamak, and by now the minor powers were very much in the race. 5 years after the revolution, 18 tokamaks were running in various parts of the world. There are 4, naturally, in Moscow, 2 in Leningrad, 1 on the Black Sea, there's 1 in Paris, and another in Munich. America has 6, 1 in Oak Ridge, 2 in Princeton, 1 in San Diego, 1 in MIT, and the Texas tokamak in Austin. The Japanese have got themselves 2, and even the Australians have 1 in Canberra. The Russian tokamaks, like their T3, had hotter plasmas for a start. The British built their own, Clio, and pushed up the density. The Americans were quick to produce tokamaks with similar characteristics, but the progress towards fusion becomes clearer. T4, the biggest Russian machine so far, and leading the field at the moment, the French TFR, halfway there. Tokamaks have now a virtual monopoly of good results.
Ready to roll, Dan.
Let it roll, Bob.
This one is Princeton's ATC, medium size, but achieving a temperature of nearly 9 million degrees. It's computer controlled, and it has one very special feature. In the 100th of a second that the plasma lasts, it's squeezed inwards. Frame by frame, cinefilm shows the point. This is a cross-section through the plasma. As the squeeze is turned on, the plasma itself shrinks to a tiny thread, stepping up its density and temperature about 5 times. Eventually it hits the wall and collapses.
It's very reproducible.
The designers of ATC see it as an experiment in precise plasma control rather than a prototype reactor. But every bit of information they collect could contribute to the fusion reactor that will have to be designed one day.
It was a very narrow profile.
The good performance of ATC has already helped to confirm one thing. America, like Russia, is putting the big money into tokamaks.
Well, it looks pretty good.
America has taken the financial plunge. By 1975, this gigantic coil will be part of the new pride of Princeton, PLT, the tokamak of the 70s. It'll be the first machine in fusion history to be bigger than Zeta. This is what the finished machine will look like. PLT stands for Princeton Large Torus, and it's 13 million bucks worth. This wooden model isn't just for show either. It's got a purpose.
Can you get under there a minute, Joe? Underneath the vacuum vessel?
The conductors that will be needed to weave PLT's magnetic web round its plasma are extremely complex. The only way to work out the right order to assemble them was to build a model and try it.
All right. A little bit more.
The fusion program in the United States over the course of the past 22 years has spent about $500 million. Research and development in energy requires a great deal of time and money. If one takes a look at just the scientific aspects of the problem, one sees only part of what the total problem is. If you, for instance, consider the problem of going to the moon, which was a tremendous scientific feat. We did that in approximately 10 years. It would have taken 20 years if we had insisted that people go to the moon at 10 cents a mile.
The next generation machines like T-10, the big Russian tokamak nearing completion, and the American PLT will mean a hefty investment, even for the superpowers. But the newest entry on the drawing board is European, JET, the Joint European Tokamak. Led by Dr. Paul Rebu of France, a team of physicists from 6 European countries is meeting to design the machine that will be twice the size of the American and Soviet efforts. The message for smaller nations is clear. Competing in fusion means collaboration. Throughout the 3-year design project, this team will pool its technical know-how.
So how much margin is there in the stress, which is presumably the west stress is here, is it?
It's roughly of 1.15 less. Yes, 15%.
For the first time, their tokamak will have an outside chance of actually achieving fusion conditions.
Business. Oh, we have not. We have.
Tokamaks are not cheap, especially on this scale, and the project will require the combined resources of Britain and Euratom.
The current spend there is about 20 million per year. I think if we're to meet the sort of target which I've mentioned, we shall need a larger investment. I think it ought to rise to perhaps £50 million a year in Western Europe. And if we suppose it takes us 20 years, we're clearly talking about an investment of about £1,000 million over this time.
The JET team hope that their machine will come into operation in 1978, but exactly where in Europe it will be built has yet to be decided. One thing is virtually certain: it will be a tokamak. But there may be hazards to opting for a tokamak system too soon. The biggest one built so far is here at Fontenay, just outside Paris, the TFR. According to tokamak law, the bigger the better. Plasma confinement times go up rapidly as the size of the machine increases, and it's this fact that generates the optimism about even bigger tokamaks. What is slightly worrying the fusion pundits, and especially the tokamak specialists, is that the French team have had their machine to bits. Its plasma has been behaving with a Gallic disregard for theory. When a hot plasma hits the walls, it can do a fair amount of damage.
A sudden failure of the vacuum system has occurred, and we couldn't repair the machine, and we have had to dismantle it completely. We have observed on the vacuum envelope of the torus many unexpected heat impacts one of them having led to a hole in the vacuum system. This was rather unexpected, and there is no explanation up to now. We will put inside solid plates of stainless steel and molybdenum in case some very severe hazard of the same kind occurs. The metal will be melted inside, but the vacuum system wouldn't be troubled.
Merely reinforcing the torus is a very pragmatic solution, and the French team are well aware of this. But they have to get the machine working again before they can study what's happening. It may be a new and unpredicted instability, or merely the freak behavior of electrons in the plasma. But until it's explained, a faint question mark will hang over the larger tokamaks. Could this be the moment for rival systems to make a comeback? Stellarators have long vanished from the American scene, but this British version, Torso, could help revitalize the concept. Its aim is to produce very high temperatures by making the plasma turbulent. These ring-shaped coils will pulse 30,000 volts through it in a millionth of a second, and the temperature should soar.
Well, let's try this then.
Torso is expected to achieve plasma temperatures of over 10 million degrees. An earlier version reached 500 million. Here they're still commissioning the machine with a series of test runs. Before they can try out the heating pulse, they must first get a stable plasma. And that's something that fusion science has never found easy.
This was in the reverter state. Yes, I think we've got the gun in the right position now. Well, stand by. Will you look at that? So I'll look over here. Okay. Hey, how about that? What do you see it in? It's a blue, isn't it? Yes.
In fusion terms, Torso is a small-scale experiment, and much cheaper to build than a large tokamak. But whatever the system, it pays to keep all options open. In America, fusion men are now borrowing inspiration from the technology of the Big Bang. In California, and just off the secret list at the Livermore Laboratory, home of America's top nuclear explosive experts, is a project that will dwarf its inventors and represents the first entirely fresh thinking in fusion in 25 years. The idea is to force a tiny solid pellet of deuterium and tritium to fuse by squeezing it inwards with incredible violence.
Okay, what would you like on the rods this time?
It'll be something like a micro-hydrogen bomb, and the Livermore team have found the ideal tool for the job, a super laser.
3 and 5. Okay, let's record that. Want me to re-zero the gain here, Bob?
This is no off-the-shelf unit. They're pushing laser technology to its limits, developing a chain of laser amplifiers 150 feet long that will be 60 times as powerful as the most destructive laser now in operation.
Ready to charge. Charging.
They're testing only a few links in the chain here, but even this brief flash will be more than their eyes can stand. When they've strung the whole chain together, its flash will be a few million times brighter than the sun.
Shut it open. Firing.
What I hold in my hand here is a pellet that might be used in a laser fusion power plant to produce energy. The size of this pellet is approximately 1 millimeter across, is about the same size as that which would be used in a power plant. And it's capable of producing as much energy as in the burning of a gallon of gasoline. Now, we know from our computer calculations that, in fact, it's easy to prove on the back of an envelope, that these little tiny pellets, which, because they're so small, must be compressed to about 10,000 times their original density. That is, you have to change the radius about a factor of 10 or 20.
To do that requires fantastic power in a very short pulse. Split up into 12 separate paths, the laser beam will be guided by mirrors to converge from 12 directions at once and slam into the pellet in the dead center of the reaction chamber. A complex computer program shows what should happen to the pellet cross-section during the crucial 25 billionths of a second leading up to the thermonuclear fusion point. As the temperature shoots up, it shrinks down to such small size that to see what happens next, the scale of the picture has to be enlarged. Eventually, as John Knuckles hoped, the thermonuclear flame front appears, hesitantly at first.
It now moves out very rapidly, so rapidly that there is not time for the pellet to move significantly, which is the demonstration of the inertial confinement principle. That is, we have compressed the matter so highly that actually all burns up before it can fly apart. When I give talks about laser fusion, I'm fond of saying something which shocks my colleagues, and that is that you're looking at a computer fantasy. The implosion process that's involved here, that is compressing things inward toward a center of a sphere, for example, was demonstrated, for example, in the first nuclear explosion at Trinity in 1945. But these processes had not been put together with a laser rather than with high explosives as are used in an atomic bomb. And that's the great breakthrough that we're rushing toward.
Glass discs doped with neodymium are the chosen laser medium. They are not cheap. But the American fusion program has little choice but to believe in these computer fantasies. There's no way of doing a small-scale test first, so money has to be found to build one of the 12 laser chains, disc by disc. If laser fusion should prove to be another false ending to the great reactor race, they'll just use the lasers for something else.
I would love to be proved wrong in being somewhat skeptical about the idea of laser fusion. Beyond its elegant physical principle lie a number of difficulties.
Firing!
One relates to getting enough energy out of the fusion reaction to power the laser in the first place. Another relates to a question of damage. These little pellets must go off several times a second for many, many years. And how does one prevent mechanical damage to the whole structure? A laser and optical system that of necessity must be very close to the pellet and that cost many millions of dollars.
Glass lasers are indeed precision instruments. If the discs were not optically perfect, they would shatter as the energy pulse passed through. The complete 12-beam laser will deliver for one tiny speck of time a power equal to the sum of all the world's power stations. This is only one of nearly 100 amplifiers that will be needed. They haven't yet assembled and tested the next size up, let alone the largest size of all, built round discs 2 feet across. Out of the whole gigantic array, the only part that definitely works so far is this small sub-chain. The building which will house the first experiment is already going up, but they'll have to wait until 1977 to find out for sure if fantasy can become reality. If things go well for laser fusion, the traditional approach will get stiff competition. And back in the other camp, they're already making their plans. This is Princeton's idea of what a reactor would look like with a tokamak system. Current US and British predictions for fusion see the first prototype generating power around 1995. The British model shows, if nothing else, that conventional concepts can rival lasers when it comes to thinking big. But there's a lot of work to be done between the model and the reactor. Fusion reactions produce neutrons, fast neutrons, which will bombard the inside of the machine from the moment it's switched on and make everything highly radioactive. Maintenance could be a nightmare, and it will certainly be necessary. These alarming photographs just published show what reaction particles can do to stainless steel. There's an economic issue too, even though seawater, the basis of fusion fuel, costs nothing. Free fuel does not automatically mean free electricity. Only a fraction of conventional generating costs are spent on fuel. When the sums are done to include all that expensive ancillary plant like turbines, where most of the money goes, fusion power doesn't look so attractive. No wonder some fusion enthusiasts are thinking ahead to designs that would do away with all that. If this is ever built, it will need no turbines. The charged particles produced by an advanced form of fusion reaction will spread out in a vast fan and on the circumference, collectors simply pluck the electric charge off them one by one. Preliminary experiments to test this idea have already been thought out. Fast charged particles are so close to the very nature of electricity itself that it seems absurd to use their energy merely to raise steam in the old-fashioned way. This experiment hopes to show that a beam of particles can be literally turned into electricity, cleanly, noiselessly, and efficiently. Teamed up with plasma devices not even attempted yet, this at last would be the complete answer. This may be far in the future, but one thing is clear. The fusion reaction that powers the sun will be tamed on Earth. And in some form or other, our children will use it to power their world. So let's give them an optimistic ending. Fusion will win through. It may not be free, but it'll certainly be there with power to spare.
That's the end of the cartoon for the children and the end of the fusion race for them. But there's a different ending, perhaps. It may not be quite so simple. Right now, controlled fusion research is a very healthy international sport. So it will continue for a number of stages to come, but in the end, perhaps it may turn out differently, because as each country sees controlled fusion economically in the cards for it, then it might go its own way, perhaps regretting it later. In the end, fusion must take its place, along with other forms of energy, in some kind of worldwide rational energy program. Up to now, the world has really not had much of a rational energy program, except perhaps for the provision of energy and the using of it to turn resources into junk, thereby giving people some transitory benefit. But that can no longer continue, because one runs out of resources, one piles up junk. And the need for cooperation grows as time goes on and we become more populous and more energy consuming on the Earth.
Every scrap of energy that we release or use on Earth, whether it's from a power station cooling tower or from striking a match, raises the temperature of the planet by an infinitesimal amount. At the moment it's too small to measure, but scientists, looking forward to the energy glut that fusion could bring, point out some salient facts. A big city like New York is hotter by 2 or 3 degrees than the countryside around it. In its streets, energy is being expended second by second, and all energy, however it's generated or used, ends up as heat. The island of Manhattan uses up each day several times as much energy as falls on it from the sun. Some of this energy is poured directly into the atmosphere, especially in summer as air conditioning units work flat out. What would happen if we had so much energy available that this was true of the whole planet? The answer, say some experts, is this. The temperature of the Earth's crust would rise by several degrees, and the effect of that on the polar ice caps would be alarming. They would melt, and the sea would rise 300 feet. But prophecies of doom like this heat death scenario of rising temperatures and worldwide flooding are so imprecise that they border on science fiction. Facts are hard to come by, and predictions of energy growth disputed. But even pessimists see no danger of this happening soon, so there's no need for anyone to rush off and see the world before climatic catastrophes change it forever. As a world expert on energy usage, David Rose concedes that such a forecast is not inconceivable.
But I think it wouldn't happen, because we would have to use several hundred times as much energy as we do at present worldwide for such a disaster. And before the pure heat death came from that, the use of so much energy would have brought us on so many other difficulties that I think other ones of resource exhaustion, of other kinds of pollution would have taken place first. To solve those other problems, will indeed require an international energy policy, international cooperation, and the ability to solve these problems on a worldwide, not just the national scale.
But can international cooperation possibly thrive in a situation of mounting energy shortages? The omens are bad. A nation facing a threat to its way of life is in no frame of mind to respond to altruism. President Nixon put it in a nutshell.
Let us set as our national goal, in the spirit of Apollo, with the determination of the Manhattan Project, that by the end of this decade, we will have developed the potential to meet our own energy needs without depending on any foreign energy sources.